Ashland University published a pretty in-depth essay that I had written about how I got to know about Wells, and some in-depth history about his genealogy that I won't get into here. So if for some reason you have questions about how this all came about, or more background about his family, it's about 4,000 words, maybe longer. So that would certainly be supplementary, and it's only been up there for a week. So it's my current level of knowledge. So in general, you're going to know a lot of these kind of things outside of Wells. If you've studied the 8th Ohio, but again, it's going through one person's point of view. One of the angles that I took as I studied this is my belief, and I'm clearly not alone, and lots of other people arrived at this before I did, that the 8th O.V.I really were unsung heroes. They weren't the only ones, but again, 20th Maine, Chamberlain, certain people got a lion's share of the attention. And the more time that goes by, the more time we realize 8th O.V.I deserve more in the telling of Gettysburg, especially on the 3rd, than they have received. So this slide here is just when I give presentations in places that don't necessarily know as much about Civil War as all of you do. And it just sets the stage on July 3rd. Here they are, the Confederate officers, they're screaming and whistling of hot shot and shell, vomiting forth fire and flame of the energy of a volcano. And it sets the stage that on the 3rd, the 8th O.V.I, only about 180 men, 200 men, I read different numbers, but a small band of men really could have used a lot of extra help. But they couldn't get it. There were too many things going on at the same time. So they really were kind of an isolated band of men. If we were to use today's language, we might call it a suicide mission. It was crazy for them to do what they did. They would have gone without food, although they downed a Confederate soldier, got some ham and cheese, and were able to eat. So this is, again, just to set the stage of probably, definitely the most tumultuous day of Wells Waite Miller's life. Certainly didn't start out that way. He was born in February 20th, 1842 in Enfield, New York. His ancestors had come from England back in the 1630s, so they'd been here a long time. One of them, and it's in my Ashland article, I talk about this, one of them was really a pretty controversial guy, or his ancestors in Puritan times. They did lots of things that Puritans didn't think you should do. So there's quite a scandal, his earliest relatives. But then they became a very respected part of the colonies. One of his ancestors fought in the Revolutionary War. By the time we get to his father, there they are in New York. It was a farming community, and his father was the wagon maker. So that was, obviously a very well needed job when you had to travel places, or you had to transport your goods and foods and those sorts of things. And Wells his mother's name was Emily Graves Miller. He did have one older brother when he was born, Lodowick, sometimes called Lodowick, and he was 12 years older than Wells. And for a while, that was all I could find about the children, and I thought that was kind of odd in the 1830s and 40s to only be 2 children in a family. And later found some more things and realized that there weren't just 2, there were 5. So Lodowick was born about 1830. And then they had more children, 1835, 1836, 1838. But they all died. They were all pretty young. They died within 2 weeks of one another. I have looked at the cemetery records, and young children and older adults were dying in a short amount of time. There were cholera epidemics in New York at that time, and so I have not yet been able to prove it, but it's likely they died in a cholera epidemic. So now we're down to Lodowick and Wells. Emily must have conceived Wells very shortly after losing 3 children, which wasn't probably as unusual then as we'd like it to be, but 4 days after Wells was born, her father died. So she was really having a tough time. I found some of her family records. It looks like she named her boys after some of her family members, which again was not especially unusual to do that. Emily's mother actually had the name Submit, which nowadays is pretty unusual, but it was a fairly common name at that time, and it could have been male or female. And so here they are. They have all these tragedies, and at some point when Wells is 10 years old, they decided to move to Ohio. They moved to Castalia in Erie County, which was a small rural community at that time, and isn't, you know, the area where they lived is still pretty rural. I've driven out there, and it's still pretty rural. Might look quite a bit like what it looked like when they arrived. Why they moved, I don't know. Maybe they needed a fresh start after all that tragedy in their lives. But when he was came, for whatever reason, he didn't continue his work as a wagon maker. He bought a farm. And nowadays, approximately where their farm is, it's Miller Road. So I do kind of wonder if later the name wasn't changed to honor their family. When they came, Lodowick's employment in the census, the next census, was listed as erratic. So I don't know what happened to him. He's got his 3 siblings who have died. The one brother, something's going on, that it's erratic. And so they started working on the farm. Just as a jump ahead, I found Wells's son's obituary when his son was 82 years old, and it listed that the farm had been in the family for 100 years. So when they settled to Castalia, they stayed with the farming. Wells was then sent from 1858 to 1860, when he would have been 16 to 18. They sent him to the preparatory department at Oberlin, which was connected to Oberlin College. Because it was 40 miles away, he likely stayed there because it's a 90-minute round trip when I drove it by car. Certainly in those days, he was not, they were not going back and forth. So surely he must have lived in Oberlin. The reason I think that's important is I've not yet been able to find out what the Millers thought about, as it was called, the slavery question, right? I don't know what they thought. I have reason to believe they had to, even if they didn't go so far as to have abolitionist sympathies, they had to have been, I guess, fairly open-minded for their time. That's because there were, at Oberlin College at that time, there were more Black students being educated before the war than all of the other colleges combined. 5% of the students were Black. 20% of the people living in town were Black. And when I compared that same percentage, granted, there were a lot more people in New York City, but only 2% of the people were Black. And so Oberlin was a very unusual town. And Wells's parents obviously deliberately sent him here. And I've even thought, well, maybe they didn't know. How, I don't know how they wouldn't know. But let's say they just didn't know that Oberlin had that kind of character. Well, in 1858, shortly after he started school there, the Oberlin-Wellington Slave Rescue made national news. People from the towns of Oberlin and Wellington, professors and students from the college, helped to rescue a man who had previously been enslaved, escaped to Oberlin, and then was retrieved by people that were called slave catchers. And when they attempted to put him on a train and take him back to the man who was his master, they prevented that from happening. It made national news. President Buchanan said that he was going to make an example of these people. Many of them, 21 of them, went to jail. Some of them went to trial. So there's no way that Wells's parents were not aware of this. And yet they kept him in the school. The following year, John Brown recruits men from Oberlin for his October raid. Again, they did not remove him from the school. So although that I can't make the case that they were abolitionists, I have to believe that they were fairly open-minded, and clearly they did not mind their son going to school with Black men and women, actually, because by then there are also women attending there. So obviously they had to have been at least reasonably open-minded people. I hope to find someday how they felt about slavery, but I have found nothing yet outside of what I can surmise. So again, of course, now here we are. the bombardment of Fort Sumter takes place. That changes everything. The 8th Ohio was organized pretty early, well, very early, on April 18th in Cleveland. Men were recruited from Cuyahoga, Erie, Lorain, and Medina counties, which would include Wells in Oberlin. And even when he was attending school, that was Lorain County. They moved to Camp Dennison on June 22nd, and they began marching as a fighting unit on 7/8/61. And the reason that is really cool for me is they started marching as a unit on 7/8/61, and I was born on 7/8/61 100 years later. I didn't know that. I didn't know any of this when I started this research, but that kind of gave me, I don't know, it was like a breadcrumb where I felt I had to keep following it. So here he is. One newspaper report stated that Wells Waite Miller was the first man from Margaretta Township to enlist. It very well could have been. There were, you counted the population in hundreds in Margaretta Township at that time instead of the thousands. And some of them were women, some of them were children, some of them were older adults. So I wouldn't be surprised if he was the first man to enlist. His enlistment date, June 17, 1861. He enlisted for 3 months, and then he re-enlisted for 3 years. When he enlisted, he was only 19 years old. Joins Company E with Erie County men. And then less than a year later, in March 1862, he was promoted captain of Company H, which would have been more Lorain County men. So he was doing well, I suppose, in his military career. Lodowick, his brother, had gotten, I guess we would call it engaged, before the war even started. The term they used is his marriage contract was solemnized. I'm assuming that's something close to an engagement. I do wonder if Wells did not enlist sooner because his brother planned to get married May 18th, 1861, and he did get married then. So if Wells was so enthusiastic as he clearly was, I did wonder if maybe he didn't leave because he wanted to be with his brother for his wedding. Shortly after, a few months after the wedding, Lodowick enlisted. He enlisted in the 72nd O.V.I, and he enlisted for 3 years. So now here's Amos and Emily Miller. They started with 5 children. 3 of them likely died in a cholera epidemic. Clearly, they died. We aren't 100% sure of the reason. And now both of their sons were out to war. This is in here for when I do presentations for people that don't know necessarily a lot about the war, that it was expected that it would be a short one. That's why Wells probably enlisted for the 3 months. That's when they were doing the shorter enlistments, but that's not what happened. As far as Lodowick, he had been fighting. He had been enlisted for just a few months. They were in Camp Shiloh, his unit in Tennessee. He became ill, and on March 30th, 1862, he died of typhoid. It's listed that he was at Camp Shiloh when it happened, and his wife was ultimately given $8 a month for her pension. She did have to prove they were married. It did look like maybe put her through the ringer a little bit, but she had the paperwork, and she did get her pension. Obviously, these documents are things that I have found in the various records. So I'm putting some screenshots of them up there. And here's the thing too, he had died just 6 days before the Battle of Shiloh, which some people have said was the 72nd O.V.I.'s greatest moment. I don't know if they ever had any moments that were not like Pickett's charge or something, but he died shortly before that. And it does make me wonder, maybe his life, I don't know, maybe something, he could have been a war hero. It's hard to know. But his life was pretty, I don't know, it's kind of sad. Didn't live that long. He was listed as erratic in the 1860 census. He didn't live very long, and he couldn't even claim it as glory on the battlefield. He died of typhoid. So here's Wells. Now he's the only surviving child of Amos and Emily. And he and his unit are on their way to Antietam, which again, is a bloody, bloody battle. The 8th Ohio, they were along Bloody Lane. They were fighting against the rebels. There were a lot of back and forth, went on for 4 hours. They ended up fixing bayonets. It just was kind of a horrifically brutal, bloody time. And then when the rebels were finally captured by the Union, they were put in. They put Waite Miller over them and told them basically to take care of them. Some reports say that he took them to McClellan's headquarters across Antietam Creek. So I got a hold of the National Park Service and asked them to confirm that for me. And they said that there's a lot of dispute, not that Wells had them, but they don't really know for sure where he took them. They have tried to trace the route of where those prisoners were taken. And all they said is, there's dispute over what really happened. So he took them somewhere. Wells was not injured in Antietam. There's a report in this Taking the Sunken Road that talks about people who were killed. Here is the snippet that's about Wells. And although narrowly escaping in many instances, was unhurt. So we know that he survived that apparently without anything horrific happening to him. Here's just a picture of Franklin Sawyer. And again, when I'm giving a presentation for families or Civil War kind of festival kind of things I've done, I talk a little bit about Franklin Sawyer. These are some pictures that I took the last time I went to Antietam from different angles, just to show the monument of where these men were. And here is a picture of Burnside Bridge that I took. And, it was said that Wells took them over this creek, but whether he did or he didn't, I guess more research needs to be done. Jumping ahead by quite a bit of time for a second. Later, William McKinley decided that somebody needed to write a short book. I guess at the time it was a report and it turned into a book about where Ohio was, what they did in Antietam. And they picked 5 men, made a committee. I believe that Wells was chosen to be part of this, at least in part because he took the prisoners wherever he took them. He saw a broader swath of the battlefield than a typical soldier would, because this covers all the units in Ohio who were in Antietam. So the book was published, and when it actually came out in a book form, they only listed the first 2 people, Daniel Cunningham and Waite Miller, as the authors. So it went kind of from a report into a book. All right, so here's Wells. Now he's the only child of his family, only one who's still living. He had survived Antietam without anything serious happening to him. And then he was captured by the Confederates. He was captured on November 12th, 1862, when they were marching. I do wonder, and this is speculation, but from what the job they assigned Wells in Gettysburg, where he led the men when this 180 to 200 band of men went into a place, an isolated place, they asked him to lead them. So he must have had some sort of role where he scouted ahead or something, because there weren't a lot of people, I don't believe, that were captured at this time. So I think he must have been separated from his unit, maybe checking some things out, and he was captured. We know that he was gone for several months. He was put into a parole camp, but he was there probably for half a year. He requested a 60-day furlough. I've got his, some of his documents where that's what he would like to do. It does not appear it was granted. At some point, he was paroled. The exchange date was sometime May, June 1863. We know he was with the unit in June, and it appears happened sometime in then. Here is where he was taken. He was taken to the parole camp in Annapolis, Maryland. And I found it was an interesting book that was specifically about this parole camp. And one of the things I learned from a different source is when they arrived there, everyone had to throw their clothes and their shoes into a creek because they were just so horrific by the time they arrived there, which is understandable. And here they're talking about 30 years later, they were still finding leather boots in the water. So here we are. Oh, and here's a description when someone climbed to the State House and took a look around, that there were white tents everywhere. So a lot of these men were living in tents rather than in some sort of, we might think of like a camp or a prison kind of scenario. When I read the book that was about this camp, it made me wonder if maybe the reason Wells was there so long, they were, when the parole started, they were still trying to follow the more gentlemanly rules that took place in previous wars, where it was kind of an informal exchange, and then that got to be pretty overwhelming. And so he was there in a time when they were, the Union and Confederates are kind of trying to sort out how does this stuff really work in a war of this size. One suggestion was a captain, in order for a captain to be paroled, the other side had to parole 6 privates. So it may have taken a while to sort out and let Wells get out of there, but got out. During this time, 8th O.V.I. participated in Fredericksburg, which I know he was not there. That I know that he was a prisoner of war at that time, and it's extremely likely that he was for Chancellorsville just because of the dates. And second of all, I can't find anything that suggests he was there. So at this point, I believe that he missed both of those battles. Definitely missed one, probably missed both. We know that he was back with them sometime in June, and June 26th, he was part of this unit again. They were crossing the Potomac River. They had gotten the news that Lee was once again, for the second time, in the north. He was in Pennsylvania. They were told that the Union Army in general was in hot pursuit, and so they were told to go double quick. They reached Monocacy Junction by the 30th, June 30th, and they described at that time that was the most fatiguing march they'd ever made. But then they had another 24 hours of marching, barely got to rest, had to cover 35, 40 more miles. There's, reports how hot it was. They had to get across swollen creeks. There are reports that if they would stop, some of the men, if they rested on their muskets, they would literally fall asleep. The heavy uniforms, the heavy machinery. So it was tough, but they did get to the point where they're approaching the battlefield now. The reports are talking about how they could hear the roar of artillery far away. They saw this dust. They knew it was bad news, that it was quite a battle going on. A courier rode out and gave them the news that Union General John Reynolds was already dead. And so they were warned that they were walking into a pretty bloody situation. By the time they reached Gettysburg, they missed day one. They were sent to sleep on top of their weapons on behind Cemetery Ridge. Here's just a picture from the Library of Congress. Okay, so July 2nd comes. They're woken up at 4 a.m. They were given something to eat, hardtack to eat. Nothing really happened. So some of the men were told they could rest again. Some of them rested for several hours, but not Wells. He was sent to lead the small group of men across Emmitsburg Road, and other men joined them. But I'm focusing on Wells's unit, and they were positioned ahead of the Union lines. They were an outpost, not skirmishers, and so they knew that they were going to have to figure this out one way or the other. Here's Franklin Sawyer's words about it. It's unusually quiet. This is where Miller was sent, told to advance to his position. And so far, so good. Pretty quiet. Then, of course, some things start happening. Sawyer starts reporting about how he had to clean out a nest of rebels by Emmitsburg Road. They're talking about how they jumped over the fence, and other artillerymen were cheering them on with their hats and their swords. Then the 8th Ohio started to fall, some killed, some wounded. So it was getting pretty challenging. At this point, Wells is perfectly fine. He is continuing. He has, other than the fact that he had been captured for a while, he so far has made it through the Civil War being unscathed. Then the repositioning, because there's a farm that's being used for skirmishing. And so they're kind of just continuing to be moved around a little bit by the flow of the battle. There it is, the night of July 2nd. They talk about how they can't sleep. They have to be exhausted, but they don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. They don't necessarily know what the enemy's going to do. There's the dead, the wounded. It had to have been the sounds of, men in pain, horses in pain. And so this report talks about how they basically stood by their arms and just waited and watched. Had to have been horrific. And then of course, July 3rd happens, where Pickett, gets blamed for all this. Whatever we want to call it, July 3rd is when the two sides were facing one another. We all know what happened to Pickett's charge when the rebels were coming across, the Confederates were coming across, and the 8th Ohio was off to one side and there to provide support. They needed to stop them. And so these isolated men were firing into the Confederate some units in the Confederacy. There were people then that later said that Franklin Sawyer had to have been drunk for what he was doing, because it was such a crazy thing. But I suppose, what are they going to do, right? I mean, they're there, they're isolated, they've got to do something. They opened fire on this Confederate brigade that outnumbered them 5-1. And it ended up, these men were probably exhausted themselves, the Confederates, and so many of them broke ranks, many of them are captured. And so that was a real success story for the 8th Ohio. And at this point, I know that Captain Miller is still again doing fine, because they're talking about how Captains Miller and Captain Pierce, I'm not sure who Captain Pierce is, but regardless, they're still leading their men. So again, at this point, Waite Miller seems to be pretty blessed. Doesn't seem like anything can happen to him. And these are just, again, this is a slide that I put in there to kind of walk people through the steps that happened in Pickett's charge. Here's the 8th Ohio. So that's just a map. And so here is where I'm talking about now. Many Civil War experts, when they look back, they believe that the 8th Ohio did not get the kind of credit they deserve. I've talked to one of the Rangers at Gettysburg, and he kind of guided me through his beliefs, and basically he believes that they did not receive enough credit, that the position that they took was more isolated than previously believed, and that they took much greater risks than, again, previously believed. So again, oh, come on, boys. It seems like every Civil War soldier in these stories that are retold said, come on, boys. But at one point, when the Confederate Union started to break rank and kind of just fell apart when they were being shot in on the side from the 8th Ohio, Captain Miller was said to say, come on, boys, and led them in there to do even more damage. His first lieutenant was Elijah Hayden. And so they were staying in that area to see what else needed to be done. And he was said to have said, hurrah, we've whipped them, they have had enough. And then he was allegedly shot, and he died. So here they are, they've accomplished something incredible. But here's the three men that were, as well as Waite Miller, his first lieutenant, Elijah Hayden, was killed. And his second, Steve Strange, was wounded. And so kind of at the very end of this, they all start getting either badly wounded or they're killed. So here is Sawyer is saying, he quotes himself as saying, when this happened, where is Captain Pierce? Where is Captain Nickerson? Where is Captain Miller? Or someone said that to him, and he explained they're all wounded and that Captain Hayden had died. It's interesting because I went on in October, not this October, the year before, I just went on a Lorain County Historical cemetery walks on Halloween. And I went there and I didn't even realize that was where Elijah Hayden was buried, but I'm walking on a field listening to him talk, and I looked down and that was his tombstone. So he's right in Elyria, the one on Cleveland Street in the cemetery. It's right by the Walgreens in Elyria. So he's buried there. So, again, this is 8th Ohio. They were a real linchpin in this battle. They didn't get the credit that they deserved. And that's one of the reasons that I became so fascinated with this unit. When all was said and done and the firing had stopped, there's Waite Miller. He's lying on the ground. Reports listed him as dangerously wounded. Later, he said that he thought the enemy soldiers were going to trample him to death. He expected that ultimately he would not be able to move out of the way, but that didn't happen. I showed some of the records to the Gettysburg Ranger, and he said the language that they used was kind of code to mean there was no way Welch was going to survive. So he was very seriously wounded. Here, some things I found about Elijah Hayden. Steve Strange. So it's interesting. So there's these three men, and you think, okay, so what happened? They're all in this bloody battle. What happened? Well, Wells was so badly wounded he was expected to die. He survived. Elijah Hayden had a different fate. He died. Steve Strange was wounded, and he reasonably quickly healed to the point where it looks like he was doing prison guard duty, Governor's Island in New York. And a few months after that, he was near Brandy Station. So Steve Strange obviously healed to the point where he could be of use for the military. So the three men had three very different fates from the gunshots the wounds that they received. So then, of course, the question is, where were they really? Where were the men? And some people, it's right where the 8th Ohio Monument is. And of course, now that's no longer believed to be exactly true. The monument's at Emmitsburg Road and Long Lane. That's a picture we took one of the times we were there. And so then, I looked into some things. And again, this presentation is often given to people who don't study these kind of things. So I have some information about the Memorial Association, where the local attorney thought that there should be monuments on the field. So land was purchased. By the 1870s, Union veterans wanted to put their memorials, naturally enough, where they had fought, where their fellow soldiers had died. And so this gained momentum, really, when you think about it, pretty early. Then, of course, the question, what do they look like? Where should they be placed? What way should they face? What are the texts that should be on it? All those debates, you can imagine any one of these questions, if you were on a committee, how they would be discussed endlessly. And so, John Badger Batchfelder, enters the picture. Here he is. He wasn't in the military, but he had this dream of painting the defining moment of the war. Some people, hey, pick a charge. That sounds like a defining moment. And so he likely arrived on the 6th or the 7th. I asked Dan Welch, and he said that is about as close as anybody can determine. So he was there very early after, but he wasn't there when it happened. Goes and interviews Union soldiers, officers, goes into hospitals, documents in writing what he can, sketches things. And so in reality, he was Gettysburg's earliest historian, and we are lucky in that it was early. He was given $50,000 to write a book, which is a lot of money to write a book even nowadays. Trust me, I know that for sure. That's a lot of money even today. He was given the job of superintendent of tablets and legends, and he had great authority to decide where these monuments were placed. And so the decision was they should be placed where the unit initially went into position, which makes sense. Even if they fought 2 or 3 places, you weren't going to put monuments every single place a certain unit was. They should face the incoming enemy, and that following those rules, 8th O.V.I. was Emmitsburg and Long Lane. I've talked to a few people who were very involved in Civil War research, and none of them seem to think that Batchelder's book was especially helpful. But it was what it was. He was given the job he was given. And so he would, and when again, I'm putting myself in Wells's mind, how frustrating must that have been? You were the guy who was sent to lead men to the position where you would go. So if anybody should know, it would be Wells, right? I mean, he was literally the guy that was told where to take them, and he took them. But when Batchelder would lead, groups around, he'd tell me what happened here. Their memories were apparently outweighed by what Batchelder ultimately thought was the right thing to do. Here's just a picture of the monuments. Here's just the text that's on the 8th O.V.I. And then, as time has gone by, diaries have surfaced, documents have surfaced, that the fence line was further north. And again, this is Dan Welch told me that the closest that he believes is they were by Kentucky Fried Chicken, which is at 539. So that's likely where they really were. Here's a picture of the information stands the platforms they have there that were placed in the 1980s. Gettysburg, when I talked to Dan, said they were in the process of creating new ones and that would have more updated information. I'm not sure how far along those are. What's interesting, Wells was clearly somebody, as you can see through the Antietam book, he was very much a part of the telling of the story post-war. And it does say that he was there when everything was placed. I would like to believe it got cut off. There's a picture of some men from the 8th Ohio in the bottom right of this platform. I have gotten a hold of Gettysburg, and they cannot find the names of the men that are in that photo. Certainly Wells was there. He was there. When I look at the picture, I can't really tell. The only picture I have of him, he was an older man, older for him. I can't really tell if Wells is in this picture, but he very well might be. So here he is, so badly wounded on the 3rd, July 11th. Here's a newspaper story in the Sandusky Register that's explaining what happened. And as they're saying, we are without any of the details which Captain Miller could doubtless give. He was suffering quite severely from the effects of his wound, but trust now that he is home, he will speedily recover. So that means within 8 days, he was home. I guess I don't know how long it took these men to get home, but that seems fast. And at this point, 8 days later, he was still wounded badly enough to where he could not share any of the details. So, it does sound like he had a fairly long recovery. I know one major wound, he was a right-handed man. I guess most people were right-handed then. And he was shot in his right shoulder by his collarbone. That was one of his wounds. And he more or less had to be left-handed the rest of his life. So that was one of his wounds that he had. Here, this is some reports about how his right shoulder was actually shattered. It was recommended that he remain in the hospital for simple nursing. So here it is in January of '64, and he is still receiving simple nursing for this wound. So he needed to be treated for many months. This definitely ended his military career. He never was able to be part of the war effort again. And finally, on January 18th, they discharged him because of his wounds. 8th O.V.I. obviously went on after him. They went to New York City and helped with try to control the draft riots. They were doing army duty in September 1863. They were skirmishing. They did the Wilderness Campaign. So they certainly had some things, maybe not as big as Antietam and Gettysburg, except for possibly the Wilderness Campaign. But they did go on, not Wells. And they mustered out slightly 3 years after. And during this time, there were 205 men. I've seen a couple different numbers. but this is Case Western, so I'm using their numbers. 205 members died, including 8 officers, which would be Elijah Hayden, 124 enlisted men, and then there were 73 men that also died of disease. Wells did. It was interesting that he finally married his sweetheart, Mary Helen Caswell, who also attended Oberlin Preparatory School. He married her on the first anniversary of Gettysburg, which I don't know if that was intentional. It sure sounds like something that wouldn't just be a coincidence. But they married the year after he survived what happened on July 3rd. He married someone who her family was reasonably well off. Her father was named Calvin Caswell. He was the largest wheat farmer in the area. He was very involved in local and regional politics. As far as Wells, he worked for a while as a high school teacher in Castalia. He was involved in the farm, his father's farm. I don't know how much he could do with his shoulder injury, but he was involved in it. He did some sales kind of things. They went on to have 2 children, Amos and Corinne, and then maybe through the encouragement of his father-in-law, he became involved in county level politics. He seemed a very dedicated Republican, party of Lincoln there. This is what he looked like when he was secretary of the board for the Ohio Department of Agriculture. As he got involved in politics, he became, what do they call him? One of the most well-known agriculturists in Ohio. From 1894, I think, to 1906, he was the secretary of the Ohio Department of Agriculture, although I think for a brief time he served as treasurer. But basically, this was his position. This is what he looked like during that time period. One of the things that I read about that he did that was seen as pretty shocking, progressive by some and shocking by others, he pushed to have the Ohio State Fair open on Sundays, as long as people promised not to go on the rides and do especially wild and crazy things. So he had to have been a fairly progressive person. As far as his son was named after the 2 grandpas, Amos Calvin. He went to Oberlin College, which his parents went to the Oberlin Preparatory School, which was attached to the college. Amos actually went to Oberlin College and he got a law degree. He was a practicing attorney for quite a while. He was practicing in Chicago. He was the vice president of the newly formed Firestone Tire Rubber Company. He was the president of the United States Motor Truck Company. He was a very successful man. He married a woman from Cleveland, Jean or Jeannie, I don't know, Gilbert. She liked to be called Nettie. And she was known as quite a musician. And they had 3 sons, one of whom he named after his brother, Wells Waite. As far as his daughter, she attended and graduated from Oberlin College. So they were a very well-educated family. Clearly education mattered to them. She was also quite musical. So Wells's daughter and daughter-in-law were very involved in music. At one point, his daughter, after she married, was involved in music in Europe. Her husband went to Europe, so she had to have been quite good. She married Dr. Oscar Kriebel, and we may not know who he is today. I know when I heard his name, it was new to me. But in his day, he was a well-known pastor of a Schwenkfelder church. It's hard for me to get a handle on exactly what they believed. I know that when some of the Schwenkfelder churches disbanded, they joined with some more progressive Christian churches. Some of them banded with Quakers. So I do believe that they had some pacifist leanings. They aren't real open about it, but if you kind of read between the lines, it seems like there were some pacifist leanings, and I do believe that caused some conflict because by this point, Waite Miller was considered, at least in Ohio, to be quite a war hero. And so I think there was a little little sticking point there. Her husband also oversaw the Perkiomen Seminary. It was a school, so again, education was big. He had his doctoral degree. Whereas Wells's son had 3 sons, his daughter had 3 daughters, Rita, Mary, and Louisa. And then Wells came home one weekend. He spent a lot of time in Washington because of his Board of Election duties. And he had been, sounds like, fairly seriously considering a run for governor. He was getting support. In some of the newspapers I see where they talk about, what a war hero he was, and how he had apparently discharged his duties really well in local and county politics. And so he was gaining support for a run for Ohio governor. He came home for the weekend and started complaining about a sharp pain in his ear. And his wife said, maybe we're not going to be able to do the plans we have this weekend. We may need to just stay home. He didn't really want to, but then he suddenly got worse. And then he died. He died within 2 days of not feeling well. Interesting that he thought the Bliss Farm was one of the things that kept the 8th Ohio kind of shifting position on July 3rd. And the name of his doctor was Dr. Bliss, which may be just another one of those coincidences in life. After he died, nobody expected it. He hadn't been sick. This was a shock. And in the annual report for 1906, obviously, when someone's been a leader, an officer in your organization for 12 years, they're going to say nice things. But as I read the documents that they left behind, it does sound like they had a lot of respect for him. Honest official, conscientious in the discharge of every duty, faithful to every trust. He talked about his prophetic eye, how he devoted his life when he had something that he wanted to accomplish. He built character in everything he did. Well done, good and faithful servant, mighty man, wise in counsel, decisive in action, loyal to his country in the hour of need. They kind of go on and on. Tower of strength, almost unlimited capacity for work, which does seem to be true. It's interesting that in other places too, I've seen things where they talk about his head and heart, that he used both his head and heart, which just seems kind of interesting to me that they would describe a man that way. Seems more of something they might say about a woman. Always a gentleman, always a student. Agriculture claimed his life. So it does seem like from this and some other things I've read that he was a very well-respected man. He's got quite a nice tombstone. I took the picture, and of course it's lopsided. This is in Castalia Cemetery, and when you pull in, it's pretty easy to see. It's right there. He and his wife are buried there. Right off to the side is a really tall obelisk, maybe the highest in the cemetery. That's his in-laws. And over to this side, his son and their family is buried. They're buried in the family section here. And what's interesting is I gave this presentation on March 9th to the Quincy Gilmore. And so I give this presentation, go home. That was actually the last thing I did before sheltering in place happened. So, okay, so we did this presentation. 4 days later, I get an email from someone who introduced himself, and he is a Graves Registration Officer for James A. Garfield Camp 142, Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And he said that what caught his attention is the bits and pieces that I listed about Lodowick, Wells's older brother. He said that at Shiloh National Cemetery, there's someone, S.G. Miller of the 72nd O.V.I, and nobody could track down who S.G. Miller is. There doesn't seem to be an S.G. Miller that fought with them. In another military record, there was a Ludwig Miller, and nobody really seemed to know who Ludwig was. And in another source, it's listed in Shiloh as an unknown burial. So there's all these things. It doesn't really seem attached to a person, and he says, there's any chance this could be your Lodowick? So he asked me a whole series of questions, such as when I went to Castalia Cemetery, was there a headstone for Lodowick, for his wife? I looked pretty well, and no, they weren't there. He asked me if I'd ever seen Lodowick's name look like it's spelled with an S, because again, the one tombstone says S.G. Miller. And actually I had someone I was working with, someone who was also a pretty fanatical Civil War researcher. And he showed me that. He goes, doesn't this look like Sedgwick? So I said, yeah, I can show you in a census report where it looks like an S. Had I ever seen records as Ludwig? Yes, I could give him those. And so through a series of our conversations, Lodowick's burial information was cleared up, and he is now officially in the Sons of Union Veterans database, which had not been in there before. And also that was the last of the 72nd O.V.I soldiers in Shiloh that they finally were able to name the person. As he explained to me, they've never given up on identifying soldiers even as far back as the Civil War. And here we are, 158 years after Lodowick died. He's gotten the honor that he deserves. So that is my presentation. And yes, I see information about pension records. I do have his pension records. And did they put him through the ringer? This file is so thick, and just kept, for whatever reason, I don't know, but they really questioned him pretty well. Oh yeah, good thing about Dr. Bliss is the doctor that treated Garfield. Probably so. Don't know that, but probably.
Okay, so you do have his pension records.
Terrific. I do. There's a whole lot of them.
Fantastic. I'm
sure. And they kept questioning his doctor over and over. So I don't know. I haven't quite figured out, if that's just normal procedure or if there's something that just, I kind of wondered if he worked so hard and he's doing all these things, they might have said, well, how are you disabled? But I don't know.
Good. Well, are there any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much. Glad you were able to be with us this evening.
Yeah.
Steve, there are some questions in the chat.
Well, she answered the one about the pension records, and the list. We're not sure if.
Yeah, that's interesting though.
And we have a question from Hans Kunze about the 24th O.V.I. Did it serve with the 8th? Are anybody aware of that? Are you aware of that? I guess.
I do not know.
Okay. Other comments? Well, thank you very much. Yes.
Ms. Daggett, have any information concerning the flags that were captured by the 8th Ohio?
I've been reading about those, but no, I don't. I don't have any insights really.
And for those of you who caught the name underneath that person, that's not really Carol, that's Brian Cole. This is here under false colors. This is
He's in Carol's brigade.
There you go.
Any other questions?
This is Jim Jablonski from the Quincy Gilmore Roundtable.
Hey, Jim.
Hello.
Hi there. And I just wanted to thank Kelly for for pointing out that our meeting in March wasn't such great consequences for.
Yeah, that's what he said. He goes, I'm so glad I attended. Yeah.
And we got it in just before COVID.
That is literally the last thing I did before sheltering in place. I thought I'm going to do this.
Time we've done anything.
Yep, same here.
Roundtable.
Yeah, and I do. Someone says the 8th. Oh, thank you for getting me started in this. Someone here saying how the 8th Ohio was forgotten by higher ups. Yeah, I do think I think that's starting to change. Thank goodness, but I do think they kind of got set aside for 100 years or more.
Could it be that the Pennsylvania regiments got more of the fame because they got better PR writers?
Could be. And I'll tell you what, when I went to one of the Gettysburg things years ago, man, did that guy just vent the Ranger about everyone wanting to hear about Joshua Chamberlain. He's like, please, people, ask me about someone else.
Absolutely.
He means at the time of the battle. I from what I read, they actually asked for support and were told there was none to be given. So there's probably just too much going on. July 3rd, there wasn't enough resources to go around.
Steve, could I read one quote from a member of the 73rd Ohio who witnessed the 8th Ohio's actions at Gettysburg? He said, "I was never so proud of being an Ohio man in my life as I was when I found out that the men whose gallantry had never been eclipsed on a battlefield was the 8th Ohio. I felt like yelling out, 'I am from Ohio too, bully for Ohio.'"
Wow. Where can I get that? Where did you find that?
I found that out in Buckeye and Blue. Buckeye and Blue.
Oh, I have that. Okay, then I just didn't notice that before. Thank you.
All right, Wim Vaudreuil says huzzah for the Buckeye State.
Heck yeah.
Don't go away because we have a couple things to do, but I wanted to say thank you again to Kelly, and we will be sending you this American flag,
Oh, thank you.
Soldiers and Sailors Monument on July 4th of 2020, along with a certificate to say thank you for your presentation this evening. And
Thank you.
everybody will join me in thanking you for this very informative discussion of our Ohio boys at Gettysburg, and everybody's applauding, and I got them all on mute so you can't hear it. So
I can see them.